Hey guys, I'm Alex, and I'm here at the Brandenburg Church of God on One Howard Drive here in Brandenburg, Kentucky, for an episode of our Reasons to Believe podcast. Now, we're very excited about this podcast. We pray that it's been a blessing to you thus far if you've been able to watch our previous episodes. This week it's going to be just a little bit different in the sense that I've kind of edited down some content from what Pastor Luke and I sat down and discussed, and we're going to have a two-parter. So this week we'll have part one, next week we'll have part two. The reason that we're doing it this way is because we had so much content. We actually sat down, myself and Pastor Luke, we sat down to have a discussion about supposed contradictions in the Bible. You might remember on episode 2 that we posted last week, we kind of got into the fact a little bit that, there's a lot of folks out there who will say there are these supposed contradictions in the Bible. And what we did for this week is we sat down and we brought a few of those supposed contradictions up, things that people will say are contradictions in the Bible, like this verse contradicts that verse. But what we did is we tried to look at them, we tried to study them a little bit, go in depth a little bit, and explain why they're not contradictions. If you actually look at the original text, if you actually look at the context and how it's meant to be read and understood. And because of that, because we got so deep on some of these things, there was a lot of really, really great discussion. There was a lot of really great content, but it was a lot. And so we decided just to split this up into 2 weeks worth of episodes. So we pray it blesses you. Here is part 1 of our discussion about the contradictions in the Bible. God bless.
If you were to go to the American Atheist website, they have a whole section on their website they dedicated to what they perceive as contradictions in the Bible. And I've been there, I've looked at them, and can easily refute every claim they make. What I find interesting, not more that they're making claims, which really is showing, honestly, their lack of understanding, their ignorance. And ignorance isn't a bad word; it just means they don't know. Their lack of knowledge of the Bible and how to discern, scriptures in context from Old Testament to New Testament to, so forth. But what really strikes me is not so much as they're saying this is or that is a contradiction, is why are they trying to disprove something they don't believe? Mm-hmm. I don't believe, I don't recall that I've ever, went out and tried to disprove other world religions that I don't believe in. That says a great deal to me. It almost says to me, or leads me to believe somewhat, that maybe they do know this book that we call the Bible is true. Again, why would you spend so much time, so much effort, have space on your national web page trying to disprove something that you don't believe? I've never executed that kind of behavior.
What gets me is, why is it just Christianity? You see this all the time amongst atheists, amongst those why is that section on their website the Bible? Why is it not some other religious text? Why are they not attacking Islam?
Yeah, why do they not have a section that says, these portions of the Quran has contradicted themselves? Or these or whatever world religion, their sacred text has these contradictions. It's only Christianity, and that says volumes. It says volumes because Christianity is really, why does getting off topic a bit, guys? Sorry, but why is there so much resentment in public schools today about the Bible and praying to the Christian God? But yet you can carry a Quran in most schools and nobody says that. Well, the reason is because there's power behind that book we call the Bible and the person we serve named Jesus. There's real power, and the adversary knows it, and that's why we have these kind of things. And that's why a podcast of this topic is beneficial today.
Yeah, and I've heard atheists respond to that before and say, well, we've got to refute the Christian, the Christianity and the Christian and the Bible, because they're the most vocal and they're the most, look at, oh my gosh, Islam. I mean, they're willing to die.
Extremely vocal.
They're willing to die for their, that's more than you can say of some American Christians today.
Well, to be honest, you can't get a lot of Christians out of bed to come to church on Sunday.
Yeah.
That's probably a bad thing for me to say. A true thing, but probably a poor way for me to depict that. I shouldn't have said that maybe, but it's true. Other world religions are much more devout in their service to their religions than we are. They're more vocal than we are at times. But yet, they don't get the scrutiny Christianity does. And the reason for that is there's power in the name of Christ.
And they do more in most other world religions. Islam, big example of this, they do more of what we're doing here. This training, this studying, knowing not just what we believe, but knowing why we believe it, being able to defend, being able to have the arguments. They teach them how to give arguments. Their arguments are false. Their arguments are wrong, and our Christian apologetics trumps that any day of the week.
Yeah.
But if you took the average Christian here in the United States and the average Muslim,
oh gosh,
they would be, I mean, goodness gracious.
If I could tell a bit of a, before we get into our topics, a bit of a personal story to illustrate what you just said. I spent a number of years in the military, a little over 2 decades. Traveled to the Middle East extensively, both during times of conflict and not. And particularly during times of conflict, because that kept me there longer than, first tour was 16 months, second was 14 months, and was there quite longer, greater opportunity to engage with the local nationals, predominantly Muslims. And my first trip there, I was embarrassed of how, I was embarrassed for me. I was impressed with them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not impressed because what they believe, what they claim, what they say is correct. I don't condone Islam or any other world religion at all, but I was impressed with how devout they were, even though their belief is wrong, how devout they were and how well they could defend what they believe. That's what motivated me to do some of the things I've done since then, such as formal studies and other things. But that they're very knowledgeable, very knowledgeable. In my assessment, of course, this isn't a cookie cutter comment that applies to all situations and all people, I should say. But the average Christian that I've come in contact with, if you were to put them up against an average Muslim and see how each one defends and presents their faith, the Muslim would win 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, especially the average Christian here in our Western world, here in the United States, in particular, because and I think unfortunately, I mean, we've been blessed here in this, and I know this is totally off script, but I feel like this is a really good thing to get into. We've been blessed in our country, a great free country, free to exercise things, free to do things, free to practice religion, free to and some people say, well, depending on who's in office, there's persecution of this, there's persecution of that. Look, at the end of the day, I get it, I understand it. But we haven't seen persecution in this country.
No.
I mean, you go to other countries and they're having their heads chopped off for believing in Jesus. I mean, that may sound brutal, that may sound harsh. It's the truth. And sometimes we get so comfortability and having a good kind of cushy lifestyle, I guess, which a lot of, I'm not saying there aren't people struggling in this country, but just in general, not facing that level of death threats and persecution and so on and so forth that they do in other countries, that can be obviously a blessing, but it can also cause us to become complacent. Back on to the original purpose of today's episode, we wanted to look at some of these things because, again, we do need to be prepared. We do need to be equipped and ready to come against these arguments. Are we going to have an answer to everything? No, but we should be prepared to give a defense as the Bible tells us to. 1 Peter 3:15, probably throughout many of these episodes of this podcast, you'll hear us quoting that verse quite often. Tells us to be prepared to give a defense, and something that a lot of atheists will throw out there. And the problem is, too, a lot of folks will kind of bite onto this narrative, and they'll run with the narrative without even researching it themselves. They just heard, we talked a little bit about this on last week's episode, there's a lot of folks out there, they'll hear a college professor, they'll hear their favorite atheist YouTuber or whoever read a book or something where somebody said, the Bible is filled, and it's always the Bible is filled with contradictions. Not just that there are some contradictions in the Bible, it's filled with contradictions to the point where it's just so laughable that anybody could even believe this because there are so many contradictions. And you hear that, I'm someone who doesn't believe, doesn't have a Christian foundation, hasn't studied Christian apologetics, don't know what really, okay, well, why do I even want to look into Christianity? I mean, that's, if there's all these contradictions in the Bible, unfortunately, a lot of people will hear that and they'll just believe it to be true without even going that extra step and saying, okay, well, what are those supposed contradictions?
Let me start with one. And again, due to the length of our podcast, we will not run all of these to ground and exhaust them all.
Yeah.
But if we want to provide you some bit of answer to what we propose here, but we could take each one of these examples we're going to give and do an entire podcast just on it. But one of them, a very well-known story in the Bible, of David and Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
We've learned it from when we were young, and in Sunday school. Actually mentioned it referenced it in a sermon today, and I've heard people say, well, there's a contradiction in that story when it comes to how Goliath died, because one verse there in the account says that David slew him with a sling and stone. Then you read a couple verses later there, and I believe one verse later, and it says he slew him with a sword. Now, if you take that on the surface and read it like most people will read it, I always say we can read the Bible or we can study the Bible. Study includes reading, but study is much more than reading. And we could say, well, one said this, one said that, which is right. And some people who are looking for a reason not to believe Christianity and serve the Lord will say, well, there's my reason. It's contradictory. All of it's false. I'm quitting. But that's not what it means. You've got to look at the Hebrew translation of those two words. And Goliath did die from the sword. However, the stone contributed to that death by incapacitating him. Have you ever been in I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head here. Have you ever been in maybe a part of a sports team growing up in high school or something, and maybe it was, a rival game with a adjoining county. Say it was a football game in the adjoining county, and we'll pump each other up by certain words, hyperbole. Hey, we're going to slaughter them, we're going to kill them, we're going to pounce them, we're going to annihilate them.
Mm-hmm.
We don't mean that. We mean we are going to win this contest we have between them. When the game's over and there's a winner, both teams are going to get on their buses and they're going to go back to their schools and, do what they do and carry on with life. It doesn't mean we killed them, we annihilated them, we destroyed them. It means we won the competition. In the case, I just use that as a bit of example, in the case with David and Goliath, the stone rendered Goliath incapable of doing anything else. He wasn't able to fight. It took him out of the game, so to say, and rendered him most likely unconscious, which it slew him. It terminated him. Again, that definition of that Hebrew word is very important. It stopped him from competing and doing what he was there to do as a warrior. So just like with the football game analogy, it ceased him doing that. But what really took his life and his last breath was when David took his sword and decapitated him.
Yeah, and those little language things like that, or the little nuances and things that they may have said in their culture or in that original language. Yeah. It's so important to take those things into consideration, because we may not understand it because we don't speak that language or we weren't in that culture or whatever. That's what, going back to your point about studying the Bible, not just reading it, but studying a little bit about the culture, studying a little bit about the original language. And you don't have to be, I said this before, you don't have to be a Greek scholar, you don't have to be a Hebrew Hebrew scholar. There's resources out there now. We're really blessed with the internet, and there's all sorts. Of course, you got to be careful with the internet too, where you look. But you've got resources like Blue Letter Bible and Logos software and stuff like that I'll use frequently. I've never studied this in college. I've never done anything like that to a PhD level or anything. You've certainly had that education, but I can still take Logos or Blue Letter Bible, and if I've got a question about something, I can take it back. I can say, okay, what does this word actually mean? Not just the English translation, but what did that word in the Greek say? What did that word in the Hebrew say? It doesn't take you don't have to. I mean, look at me. I'm just a dumb hillbilly. You don't have to be a genius or anything like that, because it can be intimidating sometimes for people. They say, well, I can't. You hear about, I can't study the Greek, I can't study the Hebrew. Look, we've got resources available to us now where you can look at these things. It's easy. You click, and they'll show you what this word means, the multiple meaning. Because some of these words have multiple meanings and could be different based on the context of the passage that you're reading.
Yeah. Let me give you another example. It kind of goes into what you just said about context and culture and language and these things. I always encourage people when they read the Bible to read it in context. But there's different context. There's literary context. How does that verse or that chapter you're reading, let's say a verse, for example. How does this verse relate to the entire chapter? And how does that relate to the book you're reading it in? And how does that book relate to all the other books in the Bible? It's good to get the literary context on it all. Cultural context as well. When was it written? Who was it written to? What was trying to be conveyed at the time? How does that apply to the time it was written? And there's other contexts we can get into as well. But you mentioned that, and I'm reminded of in the Gospels, Matthew and Luke particularly, they give a genealogy of Christ. Mm-hmm. Matthew, if you would lay those two books out in parallel and read the genealogies, they appear on the surface to be different. And that's another thing. Well, that's a contradiction. Matthew said it was these people. Luke said it was these people. They're different people or something. One has more, one has less. What's going on? The Bible can't be trusted. You don't know this or this or this. Context is key always. Without context, there really is no text. We got to understand the context. What's happening, Luke, we got to know who's writing it. Matthew. He was a Jewish writer writing to Jews. Right. And the culture of the Jews was a certain way. Luke was a Gentile writing to a completely different author. I used the example in Wednesday night service not long ago of how we will use certain phrases and words that require zero explanation. We just know what it means. For example, I believe I used this on a Wednesday night. I'd say, Alex, I'm going to go to the store. We would probably recognize, well, Luke's probably going to go over to the grocery store and buy something. I don't have to tell Alex I'm going to go to Kroger and I want to buy these things. If I say, hey, I need to go to the store to pick up a couple things.
Or even something we say often, another example of along the same lines, I'm going to run down to the store. Yeah. Most of the time, maybe sometimes some people, but most of the time, if I say I'm running down to the store, I live out in the boonies. I live about 20 miles away from the closest store, so I ain't physically running to the Dollar General. I'm getting in my car, I'm driving, but we understand that based on.
But we understand what that means, and that's just an example. We give you many, many more in the English language. We just say that, and we know what it means, and it doesn't require an explanation. Well, when Matthew was writing about the genealogy of Christ, there were certain things and latitudes he was permitted because he was of a certain culture, writing to the same culture, and they just knew what run to the store means. Mm-hmm. And there were certain people in the genealogy he listed that they left out. That let me back up. Did not leave out. That's the wrong word. That he didn't note in there because it took it back to how the Jews understood to a certain point in there, basically tying Christ back to David and so forth and on to Abraham. Took it back to a certain point to where the Jews knew, well, this is the correct lineage because it fulfills the things that the Old Testament said about Christ. It was able to stop. go to Luke, talking to Gentiles, they didn't have the knowledge and the burden of proof that the Hebrews had. Hopefully this is making sense.
Yeah.
The burden of proof that the Hebrews required, they needed a little more because they didn't know this. They used a different burden of proof for the genealogy, and it lists back further and a little more people. And that's why we see that. But yet, the person, again, if you're looking for a reason, the devil will give you a reason. He will say, well, this is a bunch of hogwash what they're talking about.
Right,
There's
yeah.
a contradiction. It is truly not. You've got to know the culture. You got to know who's writing to whom and what's being said. There is zero contradictions in the Bible.